including, are these ore bodies actually hydrologically isolated from the regional aquifers, as many of the mining companies that are interested in working these areas are claiming? Well, the fact that they share the same system would lead to believe that there is some sort of connection, although the mineralized zones are often upwards of 1,000 feet or more above the regional water table. Another question is, what are the roles of faults and fractures? As I said before, these can act as great transporters of groundwater and any contamination that may be within that groundwater. Are the mined ore bodies sources of easily mobilized metals, both during mining operations and after mining ceases? Are the current high uranium concentrations in locations such as Horn Creek and Salt Creek a result of past mining activity? We have a legacy contamination from previous mining efforts. Well, the recent designation of the orphan mine as an EPA Superfund site would attest to, yes, at least in that situation. And what are the roles of the flow paths, groundwater flow paths leaving these mine sites? And what are the groundwater residence times in these aquifers? For those who can't see, that is the orphan mine above the drainage of Horn Creek. That head frame has since been taken down. Now, in moving on to, in my mind, a bit more of a tangible threat to springs and seep systems, in that we're seeing effects of climate change on these resources, leads me to believe that this is a firmly entrenched process and something that we definitely need to take into account in the future. Now, climate change predictions for the Colorado Plateau in general include a general temperature rise of anywhere between 3 and 11 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century or so. Now, for those who don't think that that might be that much, that's generally the same swing as the difference between the height of the last glaciation and now. That corresponding with that temperature rise is an increase in water stresses. There's prediction for more extreme precipitation events leading to flash flooding, more runoff, and less infiltration. Now, the area obviously is not that not a stranger to dry conditions. This graph on the top here represents about the last 50 years or so of precipitation totals for the Grand Canyon. We can see that we've been through a cycle of below average precipitation, above average in the 70s and 80s, and more recently, once again, back down into a generally below average precipitation regime. The graph here on the bottom is looking at temperature changes, 5-year running averages based on the 20th century average for the state of Arizona. And we can see since the late 80s or so that we've had a pretty steady increase in temperatures. But one of the ones that's most troubling from a springs perspective is the prediction for smaller snowpacks and earlier melting on the plateaus surrounding Grand Canyon. Now, what that's going to lead to is more runoff and less chance for this water to actually be infiltrated into the aquifer systems that supply these springs and streams. Now, if you remember when I was talking a while ago about the results of the stable isotopes, we remember that these springs and seeps are being sourced primarily by winter recharge. So a reduction in snowpack and an earlier melting of that snowpack could detrimentally affect the sources of water to these locations. Now, I'd like to look at just kind of recent climate change and how it has affected one location in particular, looking at the Cottonwood Creek gauge. And that was one of those ones along the South Rim where the gauge was installed by USGS in 1994. 1995 was the first full year of operation, and it had 0 days dry. It flowed the entire year. The next few years after that, that percentage increased a little bit till about around the same time as our current drought in the late 1990s, when that percentage jumped to 30% and then 40%, until about 2004, when we had our last good winter. The percentage dropped back down to about 10%, but the very next year spiked right back up again, and 2 of the last 3 years, that gauge site has been dry for more than 50% of the year. Now, I predict with our good winter we had this year, a similar situation occurring. We'll probably have a drop and that gauge will flow for a majority of the year, But unless we get back into a regime where we have more normal precipitation, I predict the exact same thing is going to happen. It's going to spike back up again and maybe even continue to increase. So I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom about this and about how the springs and seeps of Grand Canyon have no future, but just saying that we need to understand these processes and how they affect the groundwater system that supplies these springs so we can understand and properly manage them when the time comes. So moving on, away from threats, to a happier place, talking about some new discoveries. What's really interesting about Grand Canyon is that it affords us the luxury of that sense of discovery. That the area is so vast that there may still yet be things that are undiscovered and undescribed. Well, what really constitutes a new discovery? When I came across this spring-fed falls last summer, and this thing is like 55 feet tall, it's gigantic. The fact that I was finding lithic fragments and pottery shards and things in the region led me to believe that it wasn't being discovered. And I did actually later find one mention in the historic literature of a triple-veiled falls up in the upper reaches of Cottonwood Creek. But the fact that there was no real documentation or knowledge of a site such as this just amazed me. And the fact that we can still have so much undocumented and so much yet to find is pretty exciting. Now, the only large-scale surveys that have been conducted regarding springs and seeps correspond to that late 70s Brown and Moran report that I mentioned before, where a majority of those were located flying over them in a helicopter or a plane. Other information from new locations comes from backcountry hikers, boat operators, and other research groups, such as this location over here on the right. Mac Miller Spring was documented just last year by a vegetation mapping crew. Not to say that it hadn't been known prior, but the fact that you can have a spring in the arid west that pumps out enough water to support a nice swimming hole that hasn't been put on a map or described or had somebody stake claim to that water is pretty amazing. A little of the Grand Canyon has actually been systematically surveyed for springs and seeps, which leads me to believe that there is likely to be a lot more yet to be discovered. And I'm not talking about just putting another dot on the map and saying we've got another spring, but the things that may be associated with the location of a new spring site, such as perhaps the identification of a new endemic species, or the fact that rare plants may be living at this site, or even that there might be a cultural resource site of importance somewhere nearby, as they are often correspond to one another. So it's just pretty exciting to know that there's still some other things yet to be done out there. So what is next? Well, there's going to be a large component of just keeping on. My plate's pretty full with the springs inventories, gauge maintenance, new instrumentation, database development, trend analyses on that data, the list goes on. But there's always room for new endeavors, and some of the things that I'm interested in getting into in the next year, in the coming years, is looking at cave systems for one. Now, these are really interesting hydrologically in that they aid in the groundwater transport. They're currently the sites of a number of springs. They're the paleo sites for drainage as the canyon cut through these aquifer systems. And they also often contain formations which can give us some insight into the incision history of the canyon itself. Something else that I'd like to look at is the spatial relationship to these springs and seep and archaeological resources. I have a feeling that there's one there, and it's just going to take some teasing out to see what we can find. And finally, to expand upon our springs inventory protocols, to start looking at watershed scale, interdisciplinary assessments, looking at upland vegetation and watershed scale hydrology and things like that. So, to tie it all together, hopefully, springs and seeps are critical to Grand Canyon, both as a natural resource, a cultural resource, as well as an economic resource. They're imperative to other natural resources, and are very significant to both prehistoric and historic culture. And Grand Canyon holds a wide diversity of spring types and their supported ecosystems. We have a number of different operations in place, both inventory